So Chuck is up next. Chuck's been Director of Technology at Crossref since 2002. His primary responsibility is to deal with the development and operation of Crossref's infrastructure, but he also gets involved in lots of other projects, including issues affected by new or evolving industry practices, such as open funder registry, and those involving non-journal content, like books and standards and databases. So Chuck?
I used to only do Windows, and then I grudgingly moved to the Mac, and now I can't do Windows at all anymore. I'm not unhappy about that, by the way, actually. I'm Chuck Koscher. I'm with Crossref, and I'm going to talk about funding data, formerly known as FundRef, and someday maybe we'll stop saying that, so we can just say funding data. But for a little while longer, we'll keep the referring to the older name a little bit. So the problem we're essentially trying to solve is that the recognition of the source of funding in our publications has been historically something kind of buried down someplace in the text. And in this case, it's in the acknowledgement section. It's just a phrase, some phrases, some sentences in the acknowledgement that make mention of a body that provided some funding. The name that was supplied in this acknowledgement is probably not exactly correct according to the institution's preferred way of being identified. But that's where the data has historically been placed. And it's not always in the same place either. Here's a funding statement that is not actually in the acknowledgement section. It's just in a bold titled heading section underneath the abstract called funding. So this information is now still not structured, still pretty free-flowing and just a narrative text, and it's in some place in the article that is peculiar to maybe this one example. And again, the acknowledgments section shows how we've captured this information in the past. So the funding, the supplier of the funding, the source of the funding has been captured in these various places within the narrative of the document. And in the underlying structure of the file, we typically have things like markup languages, XML, and so forth. And that data is buried in there as well. But even though it's encapsulated in some kind of tagging structure, it's still not very accessible to the machines that need to access this stuff. And so visually, the funding data is kind of random and kind of all over the place, has been. And under the covers, the data is not structured well enough for the automated machinery that we all operate to actually locate it, find it, and promote it in the ways that it's supposed to. And so the practice up till now has been difficult for both people to read this stuff in a uniform way and for the machinery to be able to work with this data. So here's another example of funding data being presented in markup, but there's just too much liberty provided to the publisher in this case to use terms and phrases that they're comfortable with. Maybe they've acquired in their own vocabulary, but it's still not useful enough for the broader goals that we have of really identifying the source of funding and tracking that to the research that's been taking place as a result of that funding. So the problem is pretty, I think, simple and clear to understand. And why do we need to solve this problem? And it basically comes down to the mandates that have been talked about, the fact that funding bodies want to be able to track the research to its conclusion as it's represented by the publication of scholarly articles. And so the funding bodies know who they fund, but they don't really track or aren't able to track where that funding goes and how it actually gets manifested in some outcomes. what has to happen in order for this to take place is we've got to get some discipline into the process of identifying this data and carry through on that discipline throughout the production cycle, throughout the workflow that affects all of the data associated with the scholarly publication. So Crossref funding data is targeted at solving this problem and coming up with an identifier that we from the Open Funded Registry is the key. It's the cornerstone of that. I think everyone has a general understanding and is in agreement that identifiers are kind of the keys to the kingdom in a lot of the metadata problems and a lot of the publication problems that we're trying to solve. The technology really needs things like identifiers, which are keys. So the Crossref Open Funded Registry was started probably 4 years ago or so, I think. That's about right. And right now, we've got over 12,000 names in the registry. There are quite a few additional alternate names for these 12,000 entries. So the National Science Foundation, of course, has an alternate name, which is characterized as an acronym. That's NSF. But it's also known as, national abbreviated in some various forms and those kinds of things. So each one of these entries has many different flavors to their name, but they're all given an identifier. And so when you see NSF in a funding recognition statement, you're not really sure which NSF they're talking about. It could be the United States National Science Foundation, or it could be an organization from China. There's many different organizations which go by that acronym. But if you had the identifier, you'd know exactly which one you were talking about. The list is freely available for anyone to use for essentially any purpose. That's a key thing to keep in mind here. So what happens here is the Open Funded Registry is out there. It's available. We expect and hope that publishers ingest that registry. They make use of it in their systems, both their manuscript submittal systems and their other automated harvesting systems. And they try to line up an identifier with a given funding statement in the articles and the other material that they're producing, and they then send that into Crossref. And so Crossref, which is really a metadata distribution organization, that's what we're primarily about. And that is taking in the metadata that's provided from the community and redistributing it and providing APIs and services to it to let other parts of the community consume that metadata. So what you're essentially accomplishing with using the funder registry is you're linking a funding source to a DOI, which represents an article, and hopefully an award number as well. And if you're really supplying a robust set of metadata to Crossref, you're also linking in the ORCID of the authors that participated in that publication to their funding. So that right there is a pretty robust map that I'm sure many people in the funding organization and many publishers could find a lot of value, and can mine this for quite a lot of information if we really were universally capturing these relationships in our metadata. So the publisher either gets the information, the ORCID, from the author upon submittal of the article, or they've got to mine it. And these are two quite different activities, each one fraught with their own problems. I think we'll hear later about some of those problems. Author has to pick a name and find the name of the organization that matches what they know is the source of their funding, and enter it into the either the manuscript submittal system or some other form to identify that that's the organization that they received funding from. We have some tools. This tool actually still needs a little bit of updating because it still has some of the old logos on it, but Crossref is providing some tools to help authors, to help publishers get around these problems. These tools are good examples, or actually they're even very useful as is in terms of deploying it within your platforms if you care to. So collecting the data from the author and having it enter accurately in the front of the process is probably the best place for this to happen. It's the one point in time when you've got the author's attention and are able to actually clarify the data, maybe perform some kind of sanitation on the data that's being provided, and make sure that we have an accurate capture of what the funding identifier is. Processing the data after the fact means you're going to operate on what's available. And that could be the narrative that's been captured in the acknowledgement section, but mining it to come up with the identifier is a bit more of a difficult task. Sorry. Once we've captured the funding IDs, the registry IDs for the particular piece of funding, then what can we do with it? Well, Crossref's main mission is in providing the APIs that allow you to, or allow anyone to mine this data and present it in some form. And Chorus is a perfect example of that mission being fulfilled. But Crossref also has a few user interfaces and that can help be used or can be used by people and organizations around this area. So we have our FundRef, our funding data search tool, which lets you just enter in the name of the funder that you're interested in. Has a little type ahead autofill process, and you can find who it is, what articles have been produced given a specific funder using this kind of an interface. You can also use our search tools to enter in a grant number. So here an example of that is being shown, and there's the results for what that grant is associated with in the metadata. When we gave this talk in November, there was only one item, and now there's 2 items for this specific grant, an article that was published in 2015. So the data is building, which is nice. Okay, so that's the problem statement and the solution proposal for Crossref's Open Registry. But I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the technical stuff. So this is an example of the funding data metadata. And it's pretty simple. It's basically the name of the organization and the identifier. The identifier is not a mandatory field. You can submit this data with just the name, but we really want the identifier to be supplied. And in this case, I'm showing an award number as well being submitted. That's basically the 3 pieces of information that we're after. If you don't supply the funding identifier, Crossref has now put in place some technology to try and find the funding identifier that goes with that name. And this is a problem that is difficult to solve, as many of you may know. Parsing text to line it up is a challenge. Here's an example that's pretty straightforward. It was very simple. It was very relatively easy for us to recognize that this organization, the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, was in fact that identifier. And we inserted that identifier for that depositor when they sent their metadata to us. Okay, so we're doing that, and we're actually picking off the low-hanging fruit here because the technology that we're employing it's fairly sophisticated, but we don't want to make any mistakes. And so we're being quite conservative in what we are matching up here. We have increased the number of IDs that are appearing in the metadata quite substantially by doing this, but there's more that I think can be done. So getting a hold of the Open Funded Registry. It's just a file. It has a DOI that identifies it. You can enter that DOI or find the link on our website in various places. But once you enter that DOI into a browser or such, you get this. And this is what the Open Funded Registry actually looks like. It's great for all the technical folks in your organizations to understand this and process it. It's not really a nice read for the beach, but all the information is in there in an XML-like format to identify all of the funding bodies that we've got identified. Crossref has a number of APIs out there. You can find details about them on the website. Here's one that I think is particularly helpful. If you have a name and you want to find out what is the registry identifier that goes with it, you can enter in that request in a browser window or in some automation, and that will return to you what we know, what we have that matches that particular name. So here's a way for publishing systems to find identifiers for the names that they've got. One of the other things that we spoke about last November, which I still think is necessary for us to do, is to allow the deposit of funding data to Crossref using the JATS structures. JATS, a little while ago, I think it was a 1.1 change, or 1.1 provided for the funding information to be provided in JATS, and here's an example of that. So funding group and funding source are all tags that line up very closely with the tag set that we defined for funding data a while ago. And I think for us to be able to do that translation automatically for folks on the fly, so when they do a deposit in JATS, we'll just extract what we need as we need it. There's a couple things, though, I think we need to have a conversation on to establish some best practices and principles. There's a lot of opportunity in the JATS tag set for us to have some ambiguities. The JATS tag set has the funding source identified as the tag where you enter the name. So you can see up there the agency or organization that funded the research on which the work was based. That comes right out of the JATS documentation. But then there's the institution tag, which has the institution name. And in the JATS documentation, it says in an address form. And if you look at the examples they have, you'll get the gist of what that means. But to me, as an implementer of somebody trying to process data, this is an opportunity for a lot of confusion and mistakes to be made. So we need to come up with some best practices on that. Where you put the Open Funder Registry ID in the JATS is pretty clear and unambiguous. It goes into the institution ID tag. But then there's some attributes that need some clarification on what we expect people to do. But the biggest problem that I really see here is that the funding data, the JATS funding data also allows a funding statement, which looks peculiarly like the acknowledgments sections that I showed in some of those earlier slides. And the opportunity for confusion here is pretty great. For if someone submitted to us, Crossref, the funding statement, there's not much we can do with that right now in terms of turning it into Crossref funding data. But this is a task that I think we clearly need to tackle. So participate. Participation in the funding data is growing. It's growing, I think, rather nicely. So let's just, we've got right now 1.25 million DOIs, unique DOIs, that have funding data. Number of funder article relationships is 2.5 million. That means that some articles have more than one funder, right? And so that's a good and growing number. It was mentioned earlier about registry names and non-registry names. So people are depositing Crossref metadata, identifying funding, and not supplying an identifier, and not using a registry name. Okay, that's permitted, and it's still happening. And so right now there are 1.2 million funder article relationships to non-registry names. There's 1.3 million funder article relationships using registry names. This is very good. Those numbers were inverted in terms of their scale. when we began, and we've been growing the number of ID-based deposits quite nicely, so we're making progress. This is good. The number of unique non-registry names, 500,000. So there's been 500,000 names identified out there for funding bodies. That's a big number compared to 12,204 registry names. So we've got some work to do there. And the number of articles with identifiers deposited, it's growing nicely. Help at crossref.org is a place where you can go to get some of the detailed technical information on what you need to do Crossref funding data. And then you can display this data in Crossmark. As some of you may know, Crossmark is a service that provides a mechanism for the display of common information about an article in a uniform format across all of our membership. And so the Crossmark dialog, which pops up, one of its key pieces of information that it conveys is funding data. And so this is a display of what a user would see if they clicked on the Crossmark icon on a page to see the funding data that's associated with that article. And so Crossmark is an excellent way to participate in funding data and to get that information displayed in a uniform format. Any member can deposit funding data. It's an optional part of the schema. There's no fee for depositing Crossref funding data at all. Funders and universities can consume this data. There's no fee to consume the metadata or to extract it or to use any of the APIs that make available this data to the community. And essentially anyone else. I don't think there are any real strict terms, conditions on the metadata at all, and so we're really encouraging the community to go for it in terms of consuming the funding data that we're providing. And that's all I have. Am I on time?